On May 1st, 2014, 20-year-old Andrew Sadek walked out of his college dorm room into the North Dakota night and vanished without a trace. 2 months later, when his brutally decomposed body was pulled from the Red River, authorities quickly closed the book, declaring that the young student had strapped a backpack full of rocks to his chest and shot himself in the head. But Andrew didn't take his own life. He was executed, and the people responsible for putting him in the crosshairs were the very authorities sworn to protect him. Autopsy anomalies, an impossible weapon trajectory, and the discovery of a secret, coercive police operation prove this wasn't a tragic suicide. It was a desperately covered-up murder. Today, we are going to expose the terrifying reality of a rogue drug task force, how they turned a minor college mistake into a death sentence, and the horrifying lengths the justice system will go to protect the badge over the blood of an innocent student. Andrew Sadek was not a criminal mastermind. He was a 20-year-old kid from a tiny farm town in North Dakota, studying electrical engineering at the North Dakota State College of Science in Wahpeton. By all accounts, he was quiet, deeply close to his parents, Tammy and John, and had never been in trouble with the law. He was weeks away from graduating, but on a campus of just 3,000 students, the local authorities were desperate to justify their budgets. Operating in the shadows of the region was SEMCA, the Southeast Multi-County Agency Drug Task Force. SEMCA was a specialized unit composed of local police and sheriff's deputies, heavily funded by state and federal grants. And the thing about grant money is that you have to prove you are doing something to keep it. You need arrests. You need statistics. In April of 2013, Andrew made a minor, incredibly common college mistake. He sold a small amount of marijuana totaling exactly $80 to a fellow student. What Andrew didn't know was that the student buying the weed was a confidential informant, a CI, already working for SEMCA. Months passed. Andrew forgot about the transaction, focusing on his final exams and his upcoming graduation. But SEMCA didn't forget. They were waiting. In November 2013, campus police officers and a SEMCA task force deputy cornered Andrew. They didn't just arrest him. They subjected him to a deeply coercive, psychologically devastating interrogation. They informed this 20-year-old kid with no criminal record that because the sale happened on a college campus, the charges were automatically elevated to Class A felonies. They sat across from him and coldly delivered a mathematically absurd threat. He was facing 40 years in a state penitentiary, 40 years for $80 worth of marijuana. His life, they told him, was over. He would never graduate. He would be a convicted felon. But then, the trap snapped shut. The lead investigator slid a piece of paper across the table and offered him a way out. If Andrew agreed to become a confidential informant for the task force, if he wore a wire, bought drugs from other students, and helped SEMCA hit their arrest quotas, they would make the charges disappear. They explicitly told him not to tell his parents. They told him not to consult a lawyer. Terrified, isolated, and facing half a lifetime behind bars, Andrew signed the paper. This is where the narrative shifts from an aggressive police tactic into a catastrophic systemic failure. SEMCA essentially drafted a college student into the criminal underworld. They gave him zero training on how to handle violent drug dealers. They provided him with no protection detail. They handed him a hidden camera and sent him out to buy drugs from people far more dangerous than he was, using him as disposable bait to climb the local narcotics ladder. Over the next few months, Andrew fulfilled his end of the bargain. He bought drugs for the task force on 3 separate occasions, capturing the evidence on video. But the task force wanted more. They demanded he set up 2 more buys, pushing him deeper into a network of dealers he was not equipped to handle. Friends later noted that Andrew became highly anxious, constantly looking over his shoulder. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, and he knew that in a town as small as Wahpeton, the people he was informing on would eventually figure it out. On the evening of May 1st, 2014, campus security cameras captured Andrew walking out of his dorm. He was wearing a dark jacket, jeans, and a black backpack. He didn't have his car keys. He didn't have a jacket equipped for the freezing midnight weather. He walked out of the frame and was never seen alive again. When Andrew failed to show up for his exams or his weekend visit home, his mother, Tammy, knew immediately that something was wrong. She contacted the campus police to report her son missing. The response she received from the authorities is one of the most infuriating aspects of this entire case. The campus police and the local authorities treated Andrew's disappearance with complete and utter apathy. In fact, a campus police officer openly lied to Tammy Sadek, telling her that they had checked Andrew's dorm room and everything was fine. In reality, the room had not been searched. When the truth about Andrew's role as a confidential informant finally came to light, the police's behavior went from apathetic to outright defensive. Instead of launching a massive manhunt for a vulnerable informant who had likely been compromised and kidnapped, the SEMCA task force decided to protect themselves. They publicly declared that Andrew had simply fled to avoid his remaining CI obligations. To cement this narrative, the police officially charged missing, endangered Andrew Sadek with 2 felony counts of drug delivery, and issued a warrant for his arrest. While his parents scoured the state, putting up flyers and begging for help, the police listed their son as a fugitive from justice. They washed their hands of him. They used him, lost him, and then blamed him. For nearly 2 months, the Sadek family lived in agonizing purgatory, fighting a police department that actively refused to investigate the disappearance of their own operative. Then came June 27, 2014. A police dive team was conducting a training exercise in the Red River, near the border of North Dakota and Minnesota. During the drill, they stumbled upon a badly decomposed body snagged on a tree branch in the murky water. It was Andrew. The state of his remains immediately painted a bizarre, horrifying picture. Andrew was wearing the same black backpack he had left his dorm with, but the backpack was now filled with heavy rocks, and most chillingly, he had a single, fatal gunshot wound to the head. The police department, the same department that had coerced him, abandoned him, and labeled him a fugitive, was now in charge of investigating his death. And within days, before the autopsy was even finalized, they began floating their official theory to the press: suicide. The authorities suggested that Andrew, overwhelmed by the pressure of his situation, had walked to the river, loaded his backpack with rocks, stepped into the water, and shot himself in the head. The audacity of this theory is staggering. It requires a complete suspension of logic, basic physics, and human psychology. It requires you to believe that a 20-year-old, planning to end his own life, decided to double down on the method. He didn't just shoot himself. He shot himself while wearing a rock-filled backpack to ensure he sank. But the physical evidence flatly contradicted the police narrative. First, let's look at the weapon. A .22 caliber pistol was found in the river near the body. This pistol belonged to Andrew's parents. The authorities pointed to this as definitive proof of suicide. But how did he get it? Andrew didn't have his car. The pistol was kept at his parents' house, miles away. There is no evidence Andrew returned home to retrieve it. It is entirely plausible and highly likely that whoever murdered Andrew stole the weapon from his family's property to stage the scene. Second, the backpack. If you are going to shoot yourself in the head, you do not need to weigh yourself down with rocks. The rocks were not a tool for suicide. They were a crude, hurried method of corpse disposal. The killer wanted Andrew to stay at the bottom of the river forever. Third, and perhaps most damning, is the autopsy. The medical examiner could not definitively rule the death a suicide. The trajectory of the bullet was strange. Furthermore, Andrew's dark jacket, the one he was seen wearing on the security footage when he left his dorm, was completely missing. If he walked straight to the river and shot himself, where was the jacket? Despite these glaring impossibilities, the local authorities clung to the suicide theory like a life raft. Why? Because the alternative was a public relations nightmare. If Andrew was murdered, it meant that SEMCA's aggressive, unregulated informant program had directly resulted in the brutal execution of a college student. It meant the police had essentially marched a lamb into a slaughterhouse, and they were legally and morally liable. The systemic rot runs deep here. The authorities didn't just fail to protect Andrew, they actively fought against his family's pursuit of the truth. When the Sadeks demanded answers, the police stonewalled them. When they asked for the case files, they were denied. The police closed ranks, protecting the grant funding, the task force, and the badge over a grieving family. An independent review of the SEMCA task force was eventually conducted, and the findings were damning. The review exposed a department running wild, with virtually no oversight. They found that the task force routinely targeted low-level, non-violent offenders, threatening them with draconian sentences to force them into dangerous undercover work. There were no standard operating procedures for protecting informants, There was no psychological screening. The police were operating a coercive cartel of their own, trading freedom for dangerous, unpaid labor. Despite this searing indictment of their practices, not a single officer was fired. No one from the SEMCA task force faced criminal charges for coercing a student, abandoning him, or botching the subsequent investigation. The very officers who pushed Andrew into the underworld were allowed to quietly continue their careers, insulated by a system designed to protect its own at all costs. Tammy and John Sadek refused to be silenced. They channeled their profound grief and outrage into a relentless campaign to change the law. Their fight led to the creation of Andrew's Law in North Dakota, a piece of legislation that places strict regulations on how law enforcement can use confidential informants, especially on college campuses. It requires police to inform individuals of their right to an attorney before signing away their lives to a task force. While the law is a monumental victory that will undoubtedly save lives, it cannot bring Andrew back, and it does not bring his killers to justice. To this day, Andrew Sadek's murder remains officially unsolved. The person who put a gun to his head and threw him in the river walks free, likely emboldened by a police department that was too busy covering its own tracks to launch a real investigation. The tragedy of Andrew Sadek is not just that a bright, promising young man was murdered. The true horror is that the system functioned exactly as it was designed to. It preyed on the vulnerable, extracted what it needed, and then discarded the remains, leaving a family broken and a killer free. It is a stark, terrifying reminder that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones holding the door open for the wolves. If you thought the police in this town were corrupt for feeding a student to the wolves to save their budget, wait until you hear how a billionaire heir literally bought his way out of a double homicide by putting the entire local justice system. Click the video on your screen to see the case the elite tried to bury forever.